The presidential debates, easily one of the most important moments in the entirety of a presidential campaign and in our political life. In the words of one strategist, this is the only job in the world for which all applicants show up to the interview and attack each other. And so what I'm going to do in this video is go through a comprehensive history of this unique creature of American politics. And we're going to break it into two parts. So in this first part, I'm going to talk about the JFK Nixon debate through the Kerry Bush debate in 2004. So that's 1960 to 2004. And we're going to call this the TV era of debates. And then part two, in another video and another episode of the podcast, we're going to talk about the social media era, which is, as I define it, begins in 2008, really a couple years after the launch of Facebook, the Obama-McCain debate through to the present day, where, as I'm recording this, we are a few days away from the September 10th debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, assuming that happens. And as just a note about this, I worked on the 2008 campaign for David Axelrod. I'm a Democratic strategist, but this is not a partisan video. I will give credit where it's due and critique where it's warranted. I also have run a communications director track for an organization called Arena, where I've trained hundreds of communications staffers, all on stuff like this. So this is something I'm passionate about, and I'm really excited to share it with you. So with that out of the way, let's start with the first ever presidential debate. People sometimes count Lincoln Douglas debates or maybe even the Federalist Papers as debates between presidents or presidential candidates, but really 1960 is it. This was a televised debate with the largest audience ever for a political event, 70 million TV viewers and plus the radio audience tuned in for this debate between Vice President Richard Nixon and then Senator John F. Kennedy. And as a comparison point, so that was 70 million just on TV. We just had a few months ago the Biden-Trump debate, which had 51 million viewers. So it's 70 million in 1960. All these years later, double the U.S. population, 51 million viewers for Biden-Trump. So that's effectively a 4x relative viewership in 1960 versus today, meaning when you take into account the total population of the U.S. That is massive. And they met in a CBS studio in Chicago.
The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency.
The candidates were seated, but they would walk up to a lectern when they spoke. It's kind of an awkward setup. The key topics for this debate were communism, labor, agriculture, leadership experience. At the time, Kennedy was facing like a Barack Obama-like knock on his short Senate record. And when you rewatch this debate, this first of these four debates that they had during that cycle, there's an incredible amount of Soviet talk. Like every answer seems to come back to the Soviet Union. Even answers on domestic policy were brought back to the comparison point of the Soviet Union and the pressure of the Soviet Union. There was this sense that the Soviet Union was catching up to us and exceeding us, and obviously those space race, etc. David Halberstam, incredible writer about sports and politics, wrote at the time about the impact of this debate. Within hours, no one could recall anything that was said, only what they looked like, what they felt like. And as background here, the day before the debate, CBS engineers installed news tubes that delivered a sharper image than normal. And as one CBS executive said, the cameras exaggerated Nixon's paleness and his heavy beard. In the seminal book, The Making of the President, Theodore White said that Kennedy was calm and nerveless in appearance, while Nixon was tense, almost frightened, at turns glowering, and occasionally haggard-looking to the point of sickness. This was the first time we had an experience with cutaway shots, meaning when one person's speaking, sometimes the camera cuts to the other person. And these were a huge point of negotiation between the two camps that continued even as the debates ensued. The Kennedy negotiator was a former TV producer named Bill Wilson, who sat in the control room and pushed the network to include more cutaways of Nixon. The post-debate tallies showed actually more cutaways of Kennedy than Nixon, 11 versus 9, 118 seconds versus 85 seconds. But if you talk to people who watched this debate, they felt like there were more Nixon cutaways just because he looked so strikingly awful. Alan Schroeder, who I'll be quoting from a lot in this video, who wrote a really good book on the history of presidential debates, he said, quote, "An additional visual factor must be considered. As black and white broadcasts, the debates exuded a documentary crispness that verged on the hyperreal, especially when compared to the debates from later color TV years. The 1960 debates offered the clarity and punch of a Life magazine photo essay come to life," end quote. Nixon seems to have gotten some bad advice, by the way, about this debate. So his running mate was a guy named Henry Cabot Lodge, who had debated Kennedy during the 1952 senatorial race. He told Nixon to take the high road and erase the assassin image, meaning that, Nixon had this reputation even back then as kind of a cutthroat guy. Nixon overlearned this lesson, and he was too deferential. In his opening statement, he said, he was basically agreeing with Kennedy. He said, "The things Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with." He later said, "I can subscribe completely to the spirit that Kennedy has expressed tonight." At one point, he opted to not even give it a rebuttal at all. In general, the debate is far more wonkish and civilized than we are used to. Let's go to one clip just to give you an example of this.
While Senator Kennedy says we are for the status quo, I do believe that he would agree that I am just as sincere in believing that my proposals for federal aid to education, my proposals for health care, are just as sincerely held as his. The question, again, is not one of goals. We're for those goals. It's one of means.
Now, these debates have a common trap for incumbents. Nixon was kind of the incumbent in this debate because he had been the vice president, and Kennedy was focused on the future while Nixon kept talking about his record. Let's go to a clip just to give you an example of what this sounded like at the time.
And it has resulted in the greatest expansion of the private sector of the economy that has ever been witnessed in an 8-year period. And that is growth. That is the growth that we are looking for. It is the growth that this administration has supported and that its policies have stimulated.
Senator Kennedy?
Well, I must say, I think the reason that the schools have been constructed is because the local school districts were willing to increase the property taxes to a tremendously high figure, in my opinion, almost to the point of diminishing returns, in order to sustain these schools. Secondly, I think we have a richer country, and I think we have a powerful country. I think what we have to do, however, is have the president and the leadership set before our country exactly what we must do in the next decade if we're going to maintain our security in education, in economic growth, in development of natural resources. The Soviet Union is making great gains. It isn't enough to compare what might have been done 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. I want to compare what we're doing with what our adversaries are doing, so that by the year 1970, the United States is ahead in education, in health, in building, in homes, in economic strength. I think that's the big assignment, the big task, the big function of the federal government.
Can I have the summation time, please?
So by and large, this just didn't go well for Nixon. Henry Cabot Lodge, after the debate, was heard to say, quote, "That son of a bitch just cost us the election." Side note, Henry Cabot Lodge, who would have been the vice president under Nixon, maybe he dodged a bullet because, years later when Nixon did get elected, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, wound up getting into a ton of trouble over Watergate. Schroeder, who I quoted earlier, said, "In what history records as the first example of post-debate spin, Jacqueline Kennedy turned to her guests at program's end and exclaimed, 'I think my husband was brilliant.'" Sidebar on this is that Jacqueline Kennedy, who is incredibly media savvy, had invited the media, certain key members of the media, for a watch party at her house as she watched it with her friends. And she was, she used this both to play up her image of youth and, her glamour, but also, as Schroeder describes, to, insert messaging into the bloodstream. Nixon didn't really know he was in trouble until he talked to his longtime secretary, who was a blunt woman named Rosemary Woods, who relayed that her parents called from Ohio and asked if Nixon was feeling well. Nixon's own mom would eventually call him with the same question. Kennedy, after this debate, basically had a lot of pep in his step, and he hit the trail like he was shot out of a cannon. He had bigger, more enthusiastic crowds. And without a doubt, I think this is the first of many examples of why debates matter. There is this, sense out there that, there's a lot of pundits were saying this before the recent Biden-Trump debate, which without a doubt mattered. But there used to be a lot of people saying these things don't matter, they don't move the dial. There's academic studies that attempt to show that absolutely not. As you'll learn throughout this history, and certainly recent history is a guide, these debates matter. Here's another quote from Schroeder on this. He said, although the mythology surrounding the first Kennedy-Nixon broadcast would greatly amplify in the years to follow, the moral of the story never varied. Presidential debates are best apprehended as television shows, governed not by the rules of rhetoric or politics, but by the demands of their host medium. The values of debates are the values of television: celebrity, visuals, conflict, and hype. On every level, Kennedy and his team perceived this, while Nixon and his did not. It is often said, I've heard this, maybe said 50 times, that TV viewers had a positive impression of Kennedy, while radio viewers had a positive impression of Nixon, meaning like the substance was there for Nixon, whereas the flash was there for Kennedy. I haven't seen any hard data to substantiate that, but the Smithsonian, in their they have a video kind of analyzing this debate. They make that claim too. So my assumption is if the Smithsonian is saying it, maybe there's some data to back that up. Some key takeaways from this particular debate. Over time, the negotiations have become more involved, in part starting with 1960, because people realized after the fact that Nixon didn't negotiate well at all. Kennedy's team was largely seemed to have won this negotiation. Later teams wouldn't want to leave much to chance. There's another rule here, which is that TV debates favor the challenger. This is something that Nixon realized before the debate. He was initially reluctant to do the debate. It would take 16 years after this series of 1960 debates before we get another presidential debate, because the incumbents would be reluctant to debate. Nixon and LBJ hid behind a technicality to duck these debates. Section 315 of the Communications Act granted all participants in a race, even fringe candidates, equal opportunities at television time. But in 1975, the FCC exempted debates from this ruling just in time for the 1976 contest between Ford and Carter, which we'll get to in a second. But just to wrap up 1960, there were 3 more debates after this first one. Nixon regained some of his lost weight that he had lost, both because he was dealing with health issues, a bad knee, and he was taking medication. He was on the stump. He regained weight. He wore makeup this time. One thing to mention, Kennedy had worn makeup. Nixon didn't in that first debate. And Nixon generally was more forceful, like he was less passive in those other debates. He's widely viewed to have definitely won the second and third debate, and there are more mixed reviews on the fourth. But the viewership was lower for all these other debates than the first one, and the impressions were largely formed. These debates probably mattered because this was a very close election. Kennedy won the popular vote by 112,000 votes. That is 0.17% of the election share. Very close election. So 1976 was a contest, to repeat it. We had a sort of period of time where there were no debates because the incumbents learned, hey, this is not in my interest. And basically anybody who is ahead, as we'll get to, generally wants to avoid these debates. But in 1976, we had a debate between Ford and Carter. Carter was way ahead when Ford started to challenge him to debates, because Ford really needed these debates. So even though he was the incumbent, he was way behind. Here's a clip of Ford later discussing his decision to issue that challenge.
I had to do something to overcome the 30-some points I was behind.
Now, here's the context. And for these next few debates, I'm going to really lay down some economic markers, because this was a period of extreme economic stress in the U.S., and these presidential contests and these debates were largely dominated by economic issues. So in 1976, the economy was suffering. There was high inflation. It was around 6%. high interest rates. The 30-year rate was almost 9%, and Ford was unpopular beyond his performance in the economy because he pardoned Nixon. Carter reluctantly accepted and says in an interview later that he was intimidated to be there up with the president. Here's him talking about that.
So a very disturbing concept for me to be on the stage with the President of the United States. I've never even met a Democratic president in my life, so that was an aura about the presidency that was quite overwhelming.
So one key figure in the Democratic Party at that time was, this sort of iconic advisor to JFK named Ted Sorensen, who helped JFK with the 1960 debates. And this was his advice for Carter at that time, which I actually think is timeless. And you could honestly give this advice to Trump and Harris today. He said, quote, "At all times be courteous, respectful, friendly in manner, even when vigorously disagreeing or criticizing, even when unfairly attacked. Do not call your opponent names or slur his character or criticize his wife, but beware of appearing too agreeable to the point of passivity." Side note on that definitely came from the Nixon experience. "Be vigorously assertive and positive, take the initiative, and avoid being on the defensive," end quote. Format: Kennedy-Nixon was in a TV studio, so there was no live audience, but the first Carter-Ford debate was held in the Walnut Street Theater in Philly, which had an audience. And for the most part, from then forward, debates were held in live audiences, in front of live audiences. There are some exceptions, like recently with COVID, for example. During that first debate, there was a solid blue background. The setup was different. The networks would go live, and the candidates were already at their lecterns, so there wasn't this sense of like walking up to a podium and then sitting back down, like what happened in the first Kennedy debate. And this debate had a lot of economic back and forth. Carter hammered Ford on the economy.
With inflation, that's right. We've got the highest inflation we've had in 25 years right now.
But although it was a spirited policy debate, you didn't get the feeling of animus and lack of respect and pettiness that I think has dominated some of the recent debates. Here is Carter discussing the debate overall, and you'll get a sense of just how different these candidates treated each other back in the day.
Yes, it was. This was really the first time I had, had a direct confrontation with President Ford. And as a matter of fact, although we were hot competitors, I had an admiration for him because I knew the difficult circumstances under which he had become president.
One interesting thing about this debate is that in the closing minutes of the debate, the audio failed.
One of the very serious things that's happened in our government in recent years, and has continued up until now, is a breakdown in the trust among our people and the
And here's a clip of Carter and Ford later discussing this moment.
I watched the tape afterwards, and it was embarrassing to me that both President Ford and I stood there almost like robots. We didn't move around, we didn't walk over and shake hands with each other, we just stood there.
I suspect both of us would have liked to sit down and relax while the technicians were fixing the system. But I also think both of us were hesitant to make any gesture that might look like we weren't physically or mentally able to handle a problem like this.
That delay lasted for 27 minutes. But, by and large, although it was a big hiccup, the most important stuff that happened at a substantive level. And some of the later debates during that cycle had some really important moments as well. For Carter, one important moment was related to a recent Playboy interview he had given where he said, quote, "I've looked at a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times," end quote. And then he went on to say, well, God will forgive him for that, etc. So Carter had to address that. This is Carter years later being interviewed about it and how he basically owns up to how this was a big problem for him.
It was a devastating blow to our campaign when this Playboy interview was published. The news reporters and the general public just totally forgot about all the issues.
And so heading into the third debate, Carter had to address this. Let's go to that moment.
The Playboy thing has been of very great concern to me. I don't know how to deal with it exactly. I agreed to give the interview to Playboy. Other people have done it who are notable. Governor Jerry Brown, Walter Cronkite, Albert Schweitzer, Mr. Ford's own Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Simon, William Buckley, many other people. But they weren't running for president. And in retrospect, from hindsight, I would not have given that interview had I had to do it over again. If I should ever decide in the future to discuss my deep Christian beliefs and condemnation and sinfulness, I'll use another forum besides Playboy.
And so people, largely believe that Carter diffused that in that debate. As awkward as it was, honestly, you could see even Ford seemed to be a little bit uncomfortable with that moment. But by far the most important moment of any of the debates between Carter and Ford happened in the second debate. And this is when Ford gave an answer to a question about Soviet domination of the Eastern Bloc.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with possibility?
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I visited Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to make certain that the people of those countries understood that the President of the United States and the people of the United States are dedicated to their independence, their autonomy, and their freedom.
Governor Carter, have your response.
And so this line, no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and there never will be, really haunted Ford. The moderator, Max Frankel, was so shocked, as a New York Times writer, that he had to ask for a follow-up, and you can see he was almost stumbling over his words. And Jim Lehrer, who we'll see a lot of, he became a fixture of the debates. He was a PBS reporter, and Jim Lehrer, Kathleen Wilson, and then UPenn professor George Seib of the Wall Street Journal, all were pulled together for a sort of a debate history. And here's them talking about the impact of this moment when Ford gave what, by all accounts, was a gaffe.
Gerald Ford said the Soviet Union does not dominate Eastern Europe. Some people would argue that cost Gerald Ford the election.
I don't think that was a gaffe. What Ford said is actually what the policy of the United States was. He didn't say it well. The administration, as well as those past, asserted that those were free peoples. They had the rights to independence.
I'm not sure to the average viewer who doesn't think a lot about foreign policy, that was a big deal.
This is another debate that really mattered. There is this, I think, sense, looking back from people, that Carter-Ford debate was kind of a landslide and that Ford kind of sowed his own seeds of decline when he pardoned Nixon. But Carter only won the popular vote in that election by 4.43%. And so that's a pretty thin margin, especially given the fact that the electorate was way more malleable back then. It was way less 50-50 and entrenched than it was before. So let's go to the 1980 debate, which was Carter versus Reagan, but there was also a third-party candidate named John Anderson. And the context of this is that the economy is really bad. Inflation by 1980 is 13.5%, so that's up from 5.76%, which was still high in 1976. The 30-year mortgage rate was 13.74%. Just think about that. some of you listen to this might have 3% mortgage rates, 13.74%, which was up from 9%, which is still staggeringly high in 1976. So economy doing really poorly. Carter's getting the blame for that. You had, the oil embargo. You had the Iran hostage situation. It was just a bad situation. And the presence of Anderson gave the campaigns an excuse for fewer debates. The negotiations got really tense. Carter skipped the Reagan versus Anderson debate, but he did debate Reagan one time 1 week before the election. The one that Carter skipped was hosted by the League of Women Voters. They threatened to place an empty chair for Carter, but eventually backed down. There are not too many notable moments from the Anderson Reagan debates, but one little part stuck out to me, and this is a question from Lee May, who's a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. Let's go to this clip.
This question comes to you, Mr. Reagan, from my colleague Lee May.
Mr. Reagan, the military is not the only area in crisis. American cities are physically wearing out as housing, streets, sewers, and budgets all fall apart. And all of this is piled upon the emotional strain that comes from refugees and racial confrontations. Now, I'm wondering, what specific plans do you have for federal involvement in saving our cities from these physical and emotional crises? And how would you carry out those plans, in addition to raising military pay, without going against your pledge of fiscal restraint?
I don't think I'd have to go against that pledge. I think one of the problems today with the cities is federal aid. The mayors that I've talked to in some of our leading cities tell me that the federal grants that come for a specific cause or a specific objective come with such red tape, such priorities established by a bureaucracy in Washington, that the local government's hands are tied with regard to using that money as they feel it could best be used and for what they think might be the top priority. If they had that money without those government restrictions, every one of them has told me they could make great savings and make far greater use of the money. What I have been advocating is, why don't we start with the federal government turning back tax sources to states and local governments, as well as the responsibilities for those programs. 75% of the people live in the cities. I don't know of a city in America that doesn't have the kind of problems you're talking about. But where are we getting the money that the federal government is putting out to help them?
So no fireworks in this moment, but what's interesting is these debates are such a great time capsule to tell you what was going on in America. It's a very time and place. And at the time, there was a crisis in American cities. And so the question, was obviously about how are we going to get a hold on these cities? But it also gives you a sense of Reagan's unique brand of republicanism, conservatism, which I think had dominated the party up until probably the mid-aughts. I certainly don't see a lot of evidence of it today, but he answered the question in a way that was, basically saying that, federal grants have too much red tape. It ties the hands of local government. This became eventually with George H.W. Bush, the 1,000 points of light, federalism, deregulatory agenda that they had. And he was, pretty substantive on that. I think, and what will be a common theme is that a lot of these debaters, Republican, Democrat, Independent, are way more coherent and substantive than the people we're used to today. Now, the second debate is where things really get interesting, and this is the one debate between Carter and Reagan. Carter pollster Patrick Cadell wrote a memo calling the debate fraught with great risk, saying that the risks outweigh the possible advantages. Reagan's pollster Richard Worthland also cautioned against debating, saying one of the keys to winning a campaign is you deal with those things you can control, and quite frankly, a debate is a game of roulette. There's no telling which way the marble will bounce. Reagan, by all accounts, beat Carter in this debate. He actually, even on the little stuff. So he surprised Carter by walking up to him pre-debate for a handshake. This is kind of the origins of the pre-debate handshake. And then again at the end, in debate prep, Reagan ignored the advice to bone up on policy and instead focused on one-liners. He was later asked, Reagan, he was really a performer. Remember, he's an actor. And one of the, by all accounts, one of the great political performers in American history, was later asked if he was nervous sharing the stage with the president. And he said, not at all. I've been on the same stage with John Wayne. And this was another one of these debates in a long line of debates where expectations were important. Reagan aide Michael Deaver said he was always thought of as this dumb actor. So when he actually used his brains and was on his feet without notes, people were blown away because they just assumed there was nothing there. You know, debate expectations are going to be a common theme, by the way. There are three big moments from that debate that I want to mention. Number one is that during the debate, Reagan posed what historian Elaine Camark has said is, quote, one of the most important campaign questions of all time. Let's go to this clip.
Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
So this line, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, which is now viewed as an iconic line. And this gets to a common tension within campaigns, something that I teach in our communications director training, which is framing what the race is about is really important. It's like the central role of a campaign. And if you're a challenger, you want to make the campaign and the debate about who's going to bring the most change. Right? You want the electorate to want change, right? That's why Reagan's asking, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If you're the incumbent, you want people to be comfortable with the status quo and almost be small c conservative. They don't want change, right? That's very hard to do when you're Jimmy Carter and the interest rates are what they were, inflation was what it was, and perceptions were what they were. So that was the first big moment. The second big moment was when Reagan uttered an iconic line, "There you go again." Let's go to this clip.
Governor Reagan, as a matter of fact, began his political career campaigning around this nation against Medicare. Now we have an opportunity to move toward national health insurance with an emphasis on the prevention of disease, an emphasis on outpatient care, not inpatient care, an emphasis on hospital cost containment to hold down the cost of hospital care for those who are ill, an emphasis on catastrophic health insurance so that if a family is threatened with being wiped out economically because of a very high medical bill, then the insurance would help pay for it. These are the kind of elements of a national health insurance important to the American people. Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again. When I opposed Medicare, there was another piece of legislation meeting the same problem before the Congress. I happened to favor the other piece of legislation and thought that it would be better for the senior citizens and provide better care than the one that was finally passed. I was not opposing the principle of providing care for them. I was opposing one piece of legislation as versus another.
Now, this is a common theme with Reagan, but what looks spontaneous was actually allegedly practiced with his mock debater, David Stockman. Even though Reagan would later claim it was spontaneous, people around Reagan said that this was actually practiced. And this is a good moment to mention that debate prep was actually way more involved by this point than it used to be. Like, campaigns were starting to take it very seriously. And actually, with each cycle from here forward, the debate preps are going to get more and more involved. Here's a clip of Reagan actually talking about his prep process with Carter.
What kind of preparation did you go through for the Jimmy Carter debate?
Well, we had come back for the final days here and had a place down in Virginia that had been loaned to us, a home down there. and so we could be campaigning more here in the East and all. And yes, we would get together and they'd throw questions at me and so forth, our people would, and we had several days of this, and I thought it helped to do that.
This was the time where Gene Kirkpatrick, George Will, David Stockman played the various roles?
Yeah, Dave most of the time, if they were doing things like that, would play Carter.
And so what we hear about here is, there's a retreat, there's a mock debate, there's role playing, people are playing Carter, right? This is how it is from then forward, right? Now, there was a third other big moment here, which is Jimmy Carter gave an answer where he described talking to his daughter Amy about what she thought the biggest issue was, which I think she said it was nuclear proliferation. And it's kind of hard to, I think by today's standards, this wouldn't be viewed as a big moment, but I think the moment was viewed by some pundits and debate watchers as kind of weird that Carter would be getting advice from his kid. Reagan actually commented on this as well years later. Let's go to this clip.
The other thing that came out of that debate was President Carter's statement about his daughter Amy, and that he had talked to his daughter about what the big issue was, and she had said nuclear proliferation. Nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament. What did you, when he said that, as you were standing there on the stage, were you aware of the fact that he had made a terrible mistake?
It seemed to me he had, because the whole thing sounded, and I think you could almost feel an attitude from the audience on it, that the president was going to make a major policy based on what a child told him, and I'm sure he didn't have that in mind, but that's the way it came out. And I was prepared to say to the people, I promised them I wouldn't ask my kids what I should do.
Now, there was one more thing I want to mention here, which was actually in the primary debate. We don't really talk a lot about primary debates in this video, but although there are some notable primary moments. There was this weird moment in the GOP debate in Nashua, New Hampshire. This was 3 days before the primary, and Reagan's main opponent was George H.W. Bush, who obviously would go on to serve as his vice president. The debate was supposed to be sponsored by the Nashua Telegraph, but the FEC said that it would violate election regulations, so Reagan wound up paying for his own debate. But the newspapers only invited George H.W. Bush and Reagan, not the other challengers. Strangely, the other candidates, though, were off to the side during this debate and were allowed to give certain statements here and there, including closing arguments. Reagan wanted to make a statement at one point in this debate, but they instructed the control room to cut off his mic. Let's go to this clip.
I have the first question, Mr. Bush.
For the question, you asked me if you could make an announcement first. And I asked you for permission to make an announcement myself.
Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute?
So super awkward moment. I mean, there's no real lesson there, but I just wanted to share it as a weird moment of history. Okay, 1984, Reagan versus Mondale. This is one of my favorite years of debates. And historians really note that this was a turning point for debates because Reagan was an incumbent who really didn't need to debate. He was going to win this election no matter what. And by agreeing to debate Mondale, Reagan is said to have solidified debates as a mainstay. He was a popular incumbent. He didn't have to do it. Alan Schroeder said, quote, if presidential debates can be said to have a savior, the honor goes to Ronald Reagan. By agreeing to appear with Walter Mondale in 1984, then President Reagan shored up campaign debates as a permanent institution. The conservative writer William F. Buckley said, quote, debates should be restricted to men who have not served as president. Men who have served should be judged by what they have done before. This was in reference to Reagan, even though Buckley went on to say in that article that he welcomed the debates, though, from sheer entertainment value. The first debate was held in Louisville, and Reagan was not good. Reagan didn't have many bad debates, but this was a bad debate, and this was part of a tradition that we know all too well with Biden's recent performance, which is that incumbent presidents tend to do really poorly in their first debates, with one exception, which is Bill Clinton in '96. And people like David Axelrod, my former boss, have said this is because they're used to being president. They're not used to being challenged. They're not used to being interrupted. But this was a true some of these debates in the mid-'80s were like true historical artifacts. Barbara Walters was kind of like a moderator of sorts between the participants and the reporters who would be asking questions. First of all, she had an incredible outfit that I can't even begin to describe to you. For those of you who are watching on video, you could see it. And she started the debate by calling out the campaigns for being too aggressive in rejecting panelists. Let's go to this clip.
Closing statements, and as I have said, Mr. Mondale will be the last person on the program to speak. And now I would like to add a personal note, if I may. As Dorothy Ridings pointed out, I have been involved now in 4 presidential debates, either as a moderator or as a panelist. In the past, there was no problem in selecting panelists. Tonight, however, there were to have been 4 panelists participating in this debate. The candidates were given a list of almost 100 qualified journalists from all the media and could agree on only these 3 fine journalists. As moderator and on behalf of my fellow journalists, I very much regret, as does the League of Women Voters, that this situation has occurred.
Now, this is a sign that the negotiations in general over these debates were getting more and more sophisticated, more and more aggressive. Campaigns were basically starting to treat these debate moderators like almost like jury selection in a trial, where there's like preemptive challenges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Reagan was basically off kilter from the get-go, right off the bat in his first answer.
And now let us begin the debate with the first question from James Wehart. Mr. Wehart.
Mr. President, in 1980, you promised the American people in your campaign a balanced budget by 1983. We've now had more and bigger deficits in the 4 years you've been in office. Mr. President, do you have a secret plan to balance the budget sometime in a second term? And if so, would you lay out that plan for us tonight?
I have a plan, not a secret plan. As a matter of fact, it is the economic recovery program that we presented when I took office in 1981. It is true that earlier, working with some very prominent economists, I had come up during the campaign with an economic program that I thought could rectify the great problems confronting us, the double-digit inflation, the high tax rates that I think were hurting the economy, the stagflation that we were undergoing. Before even the election day, something that none of those economists had even predicted had happened, that the economy was so worsened that I was openly saying that what we had thought on the basis of our plan could have brought a balanced budget, no, that was no longer possible. So the plan that we have had and that we're following is a plan that is based on growth in the economy, recovery without inflation, and reducing the share that the government is taking from the gross national product, which has become a drag on the economy. Already, we have a recovery that has been going on for about 21 months to the point that we can now call it an expansion. Under that, this year, we have seen a $21 billion reduction in the deficit from last year, based mainly on the increased revenues the government is getting without raising tax rates. Our tax cut, we think, was very instrumental in bringing about this economic recovery. We have reduced inflation to about a third of what it was. The interest rates have come down about 9 or 10 points, and we think must come down further. In the last 21 months, more than 6 million people have gotten jobs. There have been created new jobs for those people, to where there are now 105 million civilians working where there were only 99 million before, 107 if you count the military.
So James Wehart asks Reagan, whether he has a secret plan to balance the budget, and he looks like he just is not confident, and he does something that is a challenge for incumbents, which is he ran as a change candidate in 1980, and now he was more of the same. The context was that the economy was getting better. Inflation was down. Interest rates were largely unchanged. But Reagan didn't really have a handle on this in his first debate. Now, he would eventually run one of the most iconic and, by most accounts, people believe is the most effective ads in American history, called Morning in America.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Where he basically flipped the line that he had 4 years earlier when he said, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" and saying, "You are better off. Do you want to go back to where you were 4 years ago?" So it's very interesting. Now, Mondale, who, by most accounts won that first debate, said afterwards, he said he wanted to show that he was more alert than the president without being negative. He said he wanted the debate to build around that. This is kind of a continuation of what we'll call the Sorensen rule that we laid out before. Roger Ailes, obviously, who went on to create Fox News, was a Reagan aide at the time, and he told Reagan after the debate, "You didn't get elected on details, you got elected on themes. Every time a question is asked, related to your themes." And in the second debate, Reagan took that advice and he really rebounded. And there is this moment that is among the most iconic moments in debate history. Let's go to it.
Call yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Now, you'll notice in this clip that even Walter Mondale laughed at this. Washington Post reporter, luminary David Broder said, what well may have been the biggest barrier to Reagan's reelection was swept away in that moment. Reagan again claimed that this was a spontaneous moment, but Reagan aide Richard Worthland said he asked Reagan about the age question in prep, and that, quote, his eyes twinkled and he said, "Don't worry, Dick, I've got a way to deal with that question." And I'm just waiting for it to come up. And this was also a debate that had a rejoinder to the rejoinder. In the debate, Reagan reused the line that he used against Mondale, the "there you go again" line. And Benson had a good reply to this. He said, "Remember the last time you said that? You said it when President Carter said you were going to cut Medicare. And what did you do after the election? You cut Medicare." So the rejoinder to the rejoinder is also a debate staple. So that was, and this was obviously a landslide election. Reagan not only beat him in the debates, but crushed him at the ballot box. Now, 1988, this is Dukakis versus George H.W. Bush. Dukakis was the governor of Massachusetts. George H.W. Bush was the vice president. Now, debates at this point were a public expectation. So it was basically assumed that the candidates were doing debates here. Tom Donilon, who was a Dukakis advisor, who, incidentally, to show you how long some of these people are in politics, he was the national security advisor when I worked in the Obama administration. But his brother, Mike Donilon, was the main strategist for Biden recently, and was also a strategist for Biden, who also ran in the 88 primaries. So just a sidebar there. So Donilon, who is a Dukakis advisor, said whoever would emerge as the, quote, appropriate aggressor would win. This is a term I really like, appropriate aggressor. What does this mean? Schroeder wrote about this in his book a little bit. It means going on offense without turning off voters. It means being bold, not reckless or unhinged. It means being confident without being condescending. Another interesting historical sidebar is that Mario Cuomo, who is the governor of New York, and Bill Clinton were part of debate prep at the time, which is incredible to think about. and they both implored Dukakis to tell stories, to be more concrete, to rely on anecdotes and specifics as opposed to generalizations and sort of wonk speak, which was a knock on Dukakis at the time. Clinton even told Dukakis quite presciently, as we'll learn, to get angry, and that will be relevant. Bush's team was worried that he would come across as too much of a weenie, which was a real issue for him 4 years later, even though, this is crazy to think back on. He had been the CIA director, but somehow he had this and he was like a veteran and a jock and all this, but he was viewed as a weenie by the public. And so they made a big emphasis on counterpunching, and Bush advisor Lee Atwater, who, he wound up dying young, but he's in many ways viewed as the father of modern aggressive GOP campaigning, kind of a gunslinger, who, basically was a mentor to Roger Ailes and Karl Rove and all these people who would go on to dominate Republican politics. Another interesting, historical side note on this is that on his deathbed, Lee Atwater basically recanted and expressed a lot of regret for his aggressive tactics. But what he said was, quote, "The nature of the man is such that he does not go out and start a fight. He doesn't start controversy or confrontation, but if he gets hit, he hits back." So again, emphasis on counterpunching. Bush, who kind of viewed himself as ahead heading into the fall, played hardball and negotiated down the amount of debates. There were 2 presidential debates, 1 vice presidential debate. Quayle sucked in his debate. He was the vice president for his presidential candidate for Bush, but Bush was largely unharmed by that. And Bush was in a commanding position coming out of the summer, in part because of Atwater's tactics. This is the birth of modern campaigning. Atwater, Rove, Ailes. Dukakis was up 55-38 in the New York Times poll in late July. 55-38, that's pretty big. But he dropped precipitously in the weeks ahead because of the GOP convention, the debates, and nasty, nasty ads, which were, as nasty as we've seen in politics up until that point. There's a famous ad called the Willie Horton ad, which you can look up, that all basically took Dukakis out, but we'll focus on the debates here. There's one moment in a debate that some people said essentially ended Dukakis' candidacy.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America.
And so this was, part of a perception of Dukakis, that he was kind of weak and he was wonkish, et cetera, and he really played into that. When there was a series of commentators who were interviewed later on in a debate history for the Wall Street Journal who commented on just the impact of this moment.
That's all anybody could talk about the next day. Would he be for the death penalty for the person who may have raped his wife?
What would anyone say if you'd want to kill the guy? I think that really did hurt him.
And Michael Dukakis delivered a kind of bloodless answer. People came away, perhaps, with what was a pre-existing condition for Dukakis, which was that he was kind of this cold, technocrat.
But appearance is so important. People look at you and they make decisions about whether they like you or not.
So a couple takeaways from 1988. Number one, often there's one issue that defines the debate. In 1960, it was Russia. 1976, 1980, 1984, it was all inflation and the economy. 1988 was crime. The economy would again, by the way, be the main issue in debates in 92 and 96. It's the economy stupid line from, I think it was Paul Begala in 92. Lately, the campaigns haven't been as issue specific. One could argue that 2020 was about COVID, but not totally clear whether that's true. 2008 was about Iraq. That seems pretty obvious. But back then, you could look back and be like, okay, there was one issue. You watch these debates, almost every answer seems to come back to an issue. Like even 2004 was a one-issue campaign, really, as we'll get to, is about the Iraq War / the War on Terror. Second big takeaway, winning the debate is not really about winning the debate. What do I mean by this? A biographer wrote, quote, Dukakis was more serious than Bush, more articulate, more overly aggressive. He scored many more debating points, but he was ultimately less likable. In the second debate, the questioner, Margaret Warner, actually asked Dukakis about this and asked, quote, Governor, you won the first debate on intellect, and yet you lost on heart. The American people admired your performance but didn't seem to like you very much. Dukakis replied, saying he was a reasonably likable guy, which, if you have to say it out loud, really answers the question for us. So Quayle, who is like a relatively young guy, was trying to assuage doubts that he was too young. And he had an unfortunate comparison he made in this debate. Let's go to a clip from that debate with some narration by Barbara Walters.
First, I'd say a prayer for myself and for the country that I'm about to lead. And then I would assemble his people and talk.
Quayle was asked the question again and again.
Surely you must have some plan in mind about what you would do if it fell to you to become president of the United States, as it has to so many vice presidents just in the last 25 years or so.
As he struggled to answer, Quayle made a fateful comparison.
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
Benson and Kennedy were both elected to Congress in the late 40s, around the time Quayle was born. Benson had a response ready, and he pounced.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
It's important to note that this, like many things that happen in debates, looks spontaneous, but it really wasn't. Benson's staff heard Quayle give the Kennedy comparison in August at a Missouri State Fair, and then they later incorporated a riff on that in Benson's response at debate prep. And, for you historical nerds out there, the original line in prep was actually, "You're no more like Jack Kennedy than George Bush is like Ronald Reagan." And obviously, the line that they wound up going with, "I knew Jack Kennedy, you're no Jack Kennedy," was a much more efficient, better line. And my fourth takeaway from 88, again, the electorate was more movable back then. It was more malleable, as I said. 55-38 or whatever it was, and then a landslide victory for HW. I mean, the electorate was really willing to cross partisan divisions back then, and there are probably more people, even if they were registered for one party or the other, that really voted like independents. Okay, 1992. This is a fun election. This is Clinton versus Bush, who's the incumbent, versus Perot, an independent candidate who was as serious an independent candidate as we have ever had. The Bush campaign dragged their feet in negotiations over debate, but the public at this point expected debates. And people started dressing up in chicken suits and showing up at Bush rallies and on TV. They were inspired by a man named Chicken George, who would dress up and protest. I believe he was a guy from East Lansing, Michigan, and then others started to copy that. Craig Smith, national field director for the Clinton campaign, said, "You know what they say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. This one bloomed pretty nicely," meaning this was like a joke about the HW line about 1,000 points of light, let 1,000 flowers bloom, which was a federalism line, but they were using it to say, let's have more Chicken Georges. President Bush took the bait during a Midwest campaign stop, and a protester had a sign saying, "Chicken George won't debate," which prompted George to say, "You talking about the draft record chicken, or are you talking about the chicken in the Arkansas River? Which one are you talking about? Which one? Get out of here. Maybe it's the draft. Is that what's bothering you?" This obviously made news. The leader of the free world, either arguing with a chicken or about a chicken. Not a great look. Bush's delay in agreeing to debates, though, did create a condensed schedule, the most condensed we've ever had. There were 4 debates, when you include the vice presidential debates, in a 9-day span. There were, and this is the first and only 3-person debates that we've had at the national level. And this was, very interesting, times. Ross Perot at various points in this campaign was leading in the polls as an independent candidate. He was even on the cover of Time magazine. But, this is for another podcast. Perot was quite erratic and wound up dropping out and then re-entering the race, but the damage was done. I remember my own father, who's, a very, very consistent Republican voter, was very Perot during that initial period of time. But then when Perot dropped out, switched his allegiance to H.W. Bush and literally has never looked back since. There are a few key debates, moments here. During the first debate, Clinton was prepared for attacks on his patriotism, which had landed with Dukakis, but Clinton didn't want those to hit him. He was asked, he said in response to an attack from George H.W. Bush, he says, your father, which was Senator Prescott Bush, your father was right to stand up to Joe McCarthy. You were wrong to attack my patriotism. This was a bad moment for Bush because Bush was seen as scribbling notes during this exchange and looking down. She made it look like he was kind of meek after, saying something so personal to Clinton. He wouldn't look him in the eyes. And this is another lesson that the camera is always on you. This is a lesson that Nixon should have taught us. George Stephanopoulos, who was the young press secretary and press guy for Clinton, said the exchange played out, quote, word for word the way we wanted it to. But one of my favorite moments in debate history came in the town hall meeting. This is the first town hall meeting of its kind, where the candidates were kind of sitting in stools, and there would be an audience. In this case, it was in Richmond, Virginia. And Clinton, interestingly, knew this was going to be a good format for him. He was a young guy. He was enthusiastic. He knew how to connect with voters. And he actually inserted himself into the debate negotiations and insisted on this, according to Mickey Cantor. And Begala said, quote, when word came back that the president's folks had agreed to the debate, we were hooting and hollering. We couldn't believe it. And Begala, by the way, in case it's not obvious, was a Clinton strategist. The Bush team agreed to this because they thought Richmond as a location would produce a conservative audience. And this produced one of the more interesting moments in debate history. Let's just play this full exchange for you. It's quite long, but absolutely mesmerizing.
Investing more, better education system. Thank you. Glad to clarify.
Tell me how it's affected you again. You know people who've lost their jobs and lost their homes? Well, I've been governor of a small state for 12 years. I'll tell you how it's affected me. Every year, Congress and the President sign laws that make us do more things, it gives us less money to do it with. I see people in my state, middle-class people, their taxes have gone up in Washington and their services have gone down, while the wealthy have gotten tax cuts. I have seen what's happened in this last 4 years. When, in my state, when people lose their jobs, there's a good chance I'll know them by their names. When a factory closes, I know the people who ran it. When the businesses go bankrupt, I know them. And I've been out here for 13 months, meeting in meetings just like this ever since October, with people like you all over America, people that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, lost their health insurance. What I want you to understand is the national debt is not the only cause of that. It is because America has not invested in its people. It is because we have not grown. It is because we've had 12 years of trickle-down economics. We've gone from 1st to 12th in the world in wages. We've had 4 years where we produced no private sector jobs. Most people are working harder for less money than they were making 10 years ago. It is because we are in the grip of a failed economic theory. And this decision you're about to make better be about what kind of economic theory you want. Not just people saying, I'm going to go fix it, but what are we going to do? What I think we have to do is invest in American jobs, American education, control American health care costs, and bring the American people together.
Now, there are a few notable things about this exchange. Number one, the question is about how the national debt affects him, and this is one thing you'll notice in some of these debates from the 80s and 90s is that there was way more conversation about the national debt than you're used to now. At one point, Bush checks his watch, which became the equivalent of a meme at the time, and Clinton's answer just really shows you his retail skill as a politician back then. This is a guy who was crisscrossing Arkansas, which barely had a TV presence, that state at the time. No social media, obviously, no internet. The whole idea, I'll tell you how it affects me. I know people by name, right? And he was. I read a memo in 2008 when I worked on the 2008 campaign that Begala wrote for the Obama campaign. I don't know if this was ever made public, but he was advising the Obama campaign on how to handle these town hall debates. And he mentioned a few things about just the stagecraft of it all. And he mentioned how Clinton moved towards the woman as he was talking to her. Whereas if you watch Bush, he kind of stands still and almost looks like he's almost in a back and forth with the woman, right? Clinton also, he has what I think Bogala described at the time as almost like a track stance. Like he's almost so excited and ready to move by the time he's getting the question. He's got like 1 foot down on the carpet, and just showing that he has that energy. It also shows like, a perennial lesson, which is being in office for a long time, being a creature of Washington, as H.W. Bush was liability. And format matters, negotiations matter. Getting this debate to be a town hall really mattered in the election. And during that 92 campaign, it was, the primary debates were getting more and more prominent. I'll rewind the clock to earlier in that primary cycle, and both 88 and 92 were really fascinating Democratic primaries. And there's a Richard Ben Kramer book about 88, 92. There's a great documentary called The War Room you could watch about it. These were really up for grabs. Lots of really interesting candidates that are household names today. But one exchange in 92 occurred between Governor Brown, Jerry Brown of California, and Bill Clinton, and it got nasty. Let's go to this clip.
Does the question, Governor Brown, of Mr. Clinton's recent problems lead you to believe that he has an electability problem?
Yeah, I think he's got a big electability problem.
Well, what do you think it is?
I want to tell you what it is. It was right in the front of the Washington Post today. He is funneling money to his wife's law firm for state business. That's number one. Number two, his wife's law firm is representing clients before the state of Arkansas agencies, his appointees. And one of the key is the poultry industry, which his wife's law firm represents. And to read the local Chicago Tribune, there's 270 miles of Arkansas rivers that are polluted with fecal coliform bacteria and are unsafe for humans or fish. So it's not only corruption, it's an environmental disaster, and it's the kind of conflict of interest that is incompatible in the kind of public servant we expect from a president of the United States.
It doesn't sound like you could run as his vice president.
No, it doesn't.
Mr. Clinton, do you want to take a swing at all that stuff?
I feel sorry for Jerry Brown. I served with him as governor in the late 70s. He asked me to support him for president once.
Did you?
Of course not. He reinvents himself every year or two. In 1990, he was pleading with the courts in California not to impose any limits on contributions. His law firm took $178,000 of taxpayers' money to beat a contribution limit initiative in 1990. And so I don't think you can take much of what he says seriously. Now, let me tell you this.
Well, can I just interject something? I mean, this guy just accused you of having somebody funnel legal fees to your wife and the poultry and whatever all that.
Well, his wife's law firm. It's in the Washington Post this morning.
Is it true or isn't it true, Governor Clinton?
Wait a second, Bill. You're always trying to attack.
Mr. Brown.
You never answer the question.
Mr. Brown, let him answer.
Let me tell you something, Jerry. I don't care what you say about me. I knew when Pat Caddell told me what you were going to say, that you were going to reinvent yourself and you were going to be somebody else's mouthpiece, you would say anything. But you ought to be ashamed of yourself for jumping on my wife. You're not worth being on the same platform as my wife.
I'll tell you something, Mr. Clinton.
Now,
don't try to escape it. Ralph Nader called me this afternoon. He read me the article from the Washington Post.
Does that make it true?
I was shocked by it. I was shocked by it because I don't think someone in government should be funneling money to his wife's law firm.
Governor Clinton, you were poking your finger at him. He poked it back. It's your turn, Governor
Jerry
Clinton.
comes here with his family wealth and his $1,500 suit and makes a lying accusation about my wife.
It's in the Washington Post.
That doesn't make it true.
Are you saying they lied?
I'm saying that I never funneled any money to my wife's law firm. Never.
Well, they got $115,000 in bond business from the state of Arkansas, and you told just the other day that when people lose their jobs, you know who they are. You certainly knew people in your own administration who were giving out $115,000.
This nation is trying to elect a president. This nation's trying to elect a president.
That's right.
You carry on personally.
I think this is a critical issue.
Let me answer this.
I obviously do.
The issue is, every time I've ever run for office, because I have been a change agent, because I have worried about the problems of ordinary people, because I have given the kinds of programs that will change the lives of people. The people who run against me attack me personally. I have not attacked Jerry Brown personally. I have not attacked Paul Tsongas personally. I have not said anything about their character or their history. They have done that to me. That's what everybody I've ever run against has always done. And guess what? I win because I stand up for ordinary people and real change.
And it is a crying shame that because they read the polls in the Chicago papers today, I get this kind of criticism. My wife is a fine person who has not done anything unethical. She has given tens of thousands of free dollars worth of free time to serving our state, to doing free work for the state. There's no telling what all she's done.
Well,
now, let me finish. That has nothing to do with the electability issue. In terms of my electability, I have been attacked repeatedly over years and years and years, and none of it's ever stuck with my people who are discriminating because they know that I am a change agent. The only way we can win this election is with somebody who's tough enough to stand up to the kind of garbage the Republicans throw at you, the kind of personal attacks that I've been subject to in the last few days.
This was largely viewed as a big win for Clinton. And generally speaking, attacks that are viewed as personal really tend to backfire. It's a little less clear now with some of the things that we've seen on a national stage recently, but this has largely been a rule, and it's one that we'll keep coming back to, and this is, again, part of the Sorensen advice early on. 1996 is kind of a boring year for debates. There was initial controversy over whether to invite Perot. The Dole campaign wanted to avoid that because they felt Perot would pull votes from him. The criteria was coming from the debate commission, which was really taking on prominence. Like back in the day, there was either the networks running it, like CBS, or the League of Women Voters. But this debate commission, which really was kind of formed really by members of the Democratic and Republican Party and certain luminaries, started to issue sort of hard limits on third-party candidates. And they said that the third-party candidate had to, quote, demonstrate evidence of national organization, signs of national newsworthiness and competitiveness, and indicators of national public enthusiasm or concern. On that basis, they deemed Perot ineligible. This rule would only be strengthened in years ahead, and it would later prevent Nader from participating. Perot was livid. In a San Francisco speech, he said, "I expect that we should bring in Bosnia or Haiti to send poll watchers to help us clean up the election process in the U.S." Dole and Clinton settled on 2 debates. Clinton was in a commanding position throughout this entire campaign. They used their leverage. Leverage is a big theme here, by the way. Like, if you are ahead and you don't really need the debates, then you have more leverage at the negotiating table, and you can get more of what you want. Which, by the way, like, fast forwarding to today, which I know will be a topic in the next discussion, is what makes the Trump decision to accept basically all the terms of the debates from the Biden camp from a few months ago very puzzling, because Trump was very much ahead in the polls. The Clinton camp used their leverage to get the second and last debate scheduled during a critical baseball playoff game. The journalist Roger Simon asked Clinton aide George Stephanopoulos about that decision, and Stephanopoulos said, quote, "We didn't want people watching the debates. We wanted the debates to be a metaphor for the campaign, and we didn't want people to concentrate on the campaign." Moment of candor from Stephanopoulos. There's not a lot to discuss in these series of debates, but it's notable that Clinton faced the same major question that all incumbents have. How can you make this a more of the same election, right? You want people to want more of the same. Dole wanted to make it a change election, which is hard to do when you're kind of old stodgy. You figure like Dole. Clinton started off the first debate with the Reagan line, kind of like a riff on the sort of better off 4 years ago, while Dole tried to push the change message.
4 years ago, you took me on faith. Now, there's a record. 10.5 million more jobs, rising incomes, falling crime rates and welfare rolls, a strong America at peace. We are better off than we were 4 years ago. Let's keep it going.
Senator Dole, the President said in his opening statement, we are better off today than we were 4 years ago. Do you agree?
Well, he's better off than he was 4 years ago.
I agree with that. That's right. Thank you.
And I may be better off 4 years from now, but I don't know. I look at the slowest growth in a century. He inherited a growth of 4.7 to 4.8%. Now it's down to about 2.4%. We're going to pass 1 million bankruptcies this year for the first time in history. We've got stagnant wages. In fact, women's wages have dropped 2.2%. Men's wages haven't gone up, gone down. So we have stagnation.
But it was just an uphill climb for Dole. You know, there was 3.7% GDP growth that year. Unemployment was 2% lower than it was in 92. There was 2.9% inflation. The budget deficit, which again was an issue back then, was down significantly. It was down from $290 billion to $107 billion. during that first Clinton administration. The stock market was booming. It was nearly double the size from when Clinton took office. And interestingly, one sort of countervailing data point was interest rates, which were slightly up, but were still relatively low for that period. Clinton won that election handily. Now, 2000, George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Ralph Nader was in the mix there, but didn't participate in the debates. Bush initially was more ahead early in the process than he was later. He tried to tinker with the process in a news conference a week before Labor Day 2000. After stalling for a few weeks, he announced that he was willing to participate in 3 debates, but only if they were shorter, and if one was hosted by Larry King, who was kind of like a talk host, and one was hosted by Meet the Press. Gore said he would only debate following the presidential commission process. Rival networks said they would not carry Larry King or the Meet the Press debates, and editorial pages started to criticize Bush. This prompted some sort of excavation where people went back into Bush's record in Texas when he was governor of Texas and found some funny moments, like in 1998 where he pushed for scheduling debates on Friday nights in October, which for those of you from Texas know is high school football time. So the Bush camp had successfully minimized debates back then. Now this prompts another discussion of debate expectations. Bush was already viewed as dumb. He was viewed as trying to avoid the debates, and his actual attempts to get out of the debates, or at least minimize them, actually fed the perception that he wasn't good at debates, which in a weird way actually helped him, because it just reminded the audience and the electorate that he wasn't going to be good in these debates. And he actually wound up caving and wound up doing the debates. And in the eyes of commentators, he didn't want to fall into the same trap as his dad and invite the sort of chicken man comparison. And this was a period of time when there was a new standard implemented, which meant that if you were a third-party candidate, you needed to demonstrate 15% in national polls. Think about that today. I can't remember how high RFK Jr. has gotten in various points, but as of recently, he was at most 5% in polls. So it's a really high bar to clear, 15%. Nader was excluded, as was Pat Buchanan, who was like a conservative candidate. I think he was on the Reform line, and I think Nader was on the Green Party line at the time. The LA Times has an article that we'll link to in the show notes that where the debate panel and commission defended their decision to exclude Buchanan and Nader. Nader wrote a book after that campaign where I think it was called Crashing the Party, where he, I think, eloquently describes why these barriers are a problem. And he actually made not being allowed in the debates a sort of staple of his campaign message. As there was a lot there for him, campaign finance reform, et cetera. Bush wanted the debates as early and as spread out as possible, but they didn't get what they wanted, which actually turned out to be in Bush's favor. Karl Rove, who was Bush's main strategist at the time, said, "We thought the debates were crammed too closely together," though he admitted this schedule actually helped Bush because he got a bump from the debates just as people were heading for the polls. This was also the beginning of table debates, where some of these debates, one of the debates was a seated debate. I alluded to this in the comment I just made about Rove, but George W. Bush was viewed as the winner of these debates, which was surprising because Gore was this sort of known as this sort of, master debater. Bush was viewed as dumb. Why was Bush viewed as the winner? A couple of things. Number one, small things matter. Gore, as Bush was speaking in one of these debates, he came across as arrogant, and he would sigh as Bush is speaking.
When Bush was talking, you could see Gore listening.
And the vice president doesn't believe in exploration, for example, in Alaska. There's a lot of shut-in gas that we need to be well. This is a major problem.
New subject.
There's differences.
So Jim Lehrer of PBS, who at the time was kind of the main moderator of these debates, described later on what it was like being in that room.
I was the closest person to those two people, to George W. Bush and Al Gore. And when the debate was over, I was walking out of the hall with one of my daughters, and she said, "Hey, Dad, that was really something that Gore did." And I stopped. I said, "What did Gore do?" And she said, "Well, all that sighing and grimacing." Of course, I hadn't seen any of it. My daughter said, in fact, "Dad, that's going to be the story of the debate." And I said, "Oh, give me a break."
So it's funny that he didn't even notice, but his daughter had to tell him. I think that's really interesting. which, it's interesting, but also important because I think sometimes what happens in the room is very different than what's happening in TV, which is only amplified now with social media, where the conversation happening, the clip that comes out of the debate, sometimes it's not obvious when you're first watching it what's going to be the thing that has staying power. The second sort of main sort of standout point of these debates in 2000 was this sense that you don't want to be too aggressive, you don't want to be too thirsty. And one moment from these debates, which was in the town hall debates, really stands out to me, where Gore intruded on Bush's personal space. And we'll play a clip from this. It'll be a little less obvious for those of you listening in audio, but those of you watching on YouTube, you'll see how awkward this moment really was.
That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
All right.
What about the Dingell-Norwood bill?
All right, we're going to go now.
I'm not quite through. Let me finish.
All right, yes, go.
And then third, again, we always come back to expectations. Gore would later say, quote, that George W. Bush has made lowering expectations into a high art form. And, 4 years later, when John Kerry was preparing to debate Bush, he advised Kerry to expect a tough debate. Number 4, remember, winning a debate isn't about winning the debates. Remember what I said before? This was the sort of pinnacle of likability politics, would you want to have a beer with this person? There was an interesting exchange at the time. This was the rise of Jon Stewart, really. He really made his name during the 2000 election. And he went on Matt Lauer, the Today Show with Matt Lauer, and Matt Lauer asked, which candidate would you rather have a beer with? Stewart said, I don't want to have a beer with any of them. Lauer said, but if you had to, if I made you. And Stewart said, you know what? I want my president to be my designated driver. I don't want to have a beer with these guys. I don't want them hammered when the Russians call, The Washington Post's David Broder later said, when we vote for president, we're deciding not just whose finger will be on the nuclear button, but who we want televised into our homes for the next 4 years. It doesn't hurt to show you'd be good company. At the, this is, I think Broder's view, I think, is more accurate of where the electorate was. I personally would rather the electorate be as substantive as what Jon Stewart is describing. But even if you go back to 1960, like Nixon, if it's true, was viewed as the winner by the radio audience. Like this is about the way you look, the way you come across, like how cool you seem, how easygoing you seem, whether people want to spend more time with you. This 2000 debates were probably the pinnacle of the debate comedy. Also, SNL, which my personal favorite is 92, where you had Dana Carvey doing both Bush and Perot, the not going to do it, which is really funny, and we probably can't play it because SNL, I think, is pretty aggressive in policing their content online. But 2000 had these sort of lockbox moments, which you can Google, is really funny. They also had Will Ferrell playing Dumb Bush. It was, I remember it. I was in high school at the time, and it was high TV moment, very collective moments where, both candidates were fodder for humor at the time. All right, our last debate that we're going to cover in this video is Kerry versus Bush 2004. Now, for Kerry, despite everything that happened in 2000, Kerry also screwed up the expectations game. After getting the nomination, Kerry traveled to Quincy, Illinois, one of the stops of the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, and challenged Bush to monthly debates, and he later changed this to weekly debates. The Bush team was very good at setting expectations. One of Bush's strategists said to the media that Kerry is the best debater ever to run for president. He's going to be better than Cicero. So they knew their job. Bush declined, obviously, to debate weekly, and both campaigns agreed to the traditional slate of 3 debates. Notable to mention that Reagan in 84 and Clinton in 96 both got away with 2, but they were much further ahead than Bush was in 2004. It is largely agreed that Bush lost the first 2 debates. His debate negotiator was James Baker, who's a luminary in the Republican Party, says, quote, "I remember times when I was darn glad my candidate had another debate to make up for a poor performance in the earlier one." So Bush had a better standing in the third, which we'll get to. There was also a gap of 3 weeks between the debates and Election Day, which gave Bush time to recover from his poor performances. Bob Shrum, who is Kerry's strategist, said, quote, "For debates to have maximum impact, they need to be closer to the election itself." And there were some interesting negotiations over the VP debates at the time. The Edwards team wanted it to be standing, and Cheney's team wanted it to be sitting. James Baker, in the negotiations, said Cheney can't stand up. He just had a heart attack. Vernon Jordan, who is the Democrats' negotiator, said that's why we want him to stand up. They obviously wound up being seated. Can't have people having heart attacks. So there was no seated debate, no standing debate there. Iraq and terrorism were dominant here. Kerry came from behind to win the Democratic primary over an anti-war candidate in Howard Dean. Kerry was a Vietnam veteran who turned against the war, the Vietnam War, and he became an anti-war activist. But his big liability in the 2004 election was his flip-flopping on the Iraq War. He was supportive of the war when the politics were in its favor, and later said he was against it. And this was a huge anticipated moment in the debates. The Bush campaign had been hammering Kerry on the voted for it before I voted against it line that Kerry made about the war supplemental bill. And Kerry was prepared for this. And so in the debate, he had a line that many people thought was effective. He said, quote, "When I talk about the $87 billion, which was the supplemental, I made a mistake in how I talk about the war, but the president made a mistake in invading Iraq, which is worse." So a lot of people thought that was a blow to the battleship for George W. Bush. So that's takeaway number one, moment number one. Moment number two, I was just struck by how just substantive and relevant the discussions were during those debates to the actual things that were on people's minds, which was namely the 9/11 politics, the Iraq stuff. Let's just play a clip of what that sounded like.
Others will enforce doctrine, and the world is better for it. So to answer your question, I would hope we never have to. I think by acting firmly and decisively, it's less likely we have to use force.
Senator Kerry, 90 seconds.
Jim, the president just said something extraordinarily revealing and frankly, very important in this debate. In answer to your question about Iraq and sending people into Iraq, he just said, the enemy attacked us. Saddam Hussein didn't attack us. Osama bin Laden attacked us. Al-Qaeda attacked us. And when we had Osama bin Laden cornered in the mountains of Tora Bora, 1,000 of his cohorts with him in those mountains, with the American military forces nearby and in the field, we didn't use the best trained troops in the world to go kill the world's #1 criminal and terrorist. They outsourced the job to Afghan warlords who only a week earlier had been on the other side fighting against us, neither of whom trusted each other. That's the enemy that attacked us. That's the enemy that was allowed to walk out of those mountains. That's the enemy that is now in 60 countries with stronger recruits. He also said Saddam Hussein would have been stronger. That is just factually incorrect. 2/3 of the country was a no-fly zone when we started this war. We would have had sanctions. We would have had the UN inspectors. Saddam Hussein would have been continually weakening. If the president had shown the patience to go through another round of resolution, to sit down with those leaders, say, what do you need? What do you need now? How much more will it take to get you to join us? We'd be in a stronger place today.
First, listen, of course I know Osama bin Laden attacked us. I know that. And secondly, to think that another round of resolutions would have caused Saddam Hussein to disarm, disclose, is ludicrous in my judgment. It just shows a significant difference of opinion. We tried diplomacy. We did our best. He was hoping to turn a blind eye, and yes, he would have been stronger had we not dealt with him. He had the capability of making weapons, and he would have made weapons.
30 seconds, Senator.
35 to 40 countries in the world had a greater capability of making weapons at the moment the president invaded than Saddam Hussein. And while he's been diverted with 9 out of 10 active duty divisions of our Army either going to Iraq, coming back from Iraq, or getting ready to go, North Korea's got nuclear weapons and the world is more dangerous. Iran is moving towards nuclear weapons and the world is more dangerous. Darfur has a genocide. The world is more dangerous. I'd have made a better choice.
Third moment / takeaway here is that, Bush, who, basically won the body language sort of grades in 2000, had his own bad body language moment in these debates. Here's an excerpt from a PBS segment years later where Bush kind of talks about this body language problem that he had in these debates.
An opportunity to show the upside of what I was thinking and the downside of what he was thinking.
At the same time, George Bush was criticized for being overly expressive during that debate, much like Al Gore was in 2000.
I guess I didn't learn any lessons from the first debate in 2000. I thought I did pretty well in the first debate, and it was, you're not going to believe your facial expressions caused people to say you didn't do very well.
Mr. President, for the record, I had exactly the same experience. When the first question was asked, I looked at you, and you had a facial expression, and I decided then I would never look at anybody except the person who was talking.
Yeah.
And so when it was over, I also did not know about the facial expressions.
I think I was just being myself. I was just probably saying, I can't believe this guy's saying that, or I wasn't trying to be rude.
Sort of moment number 4 is there was this really puzzling moment that I honestly had totally forgotten about until I did a deep dive here, where Bush talks about, he gives this line around wood that I had totally forgotten about, and I honestly can't even fully explain it to you, but let's go to this clip.
The president got $84 from a timber company that he owns, and he's counted as a small business. Dick Cheney's counted as a small business. That's how they do things. That's just not right.
I own a timber company? That's news to me. You need some wood?
Moment number 5, on a serious note and a very awkward moment, was during the third debate when Kerry broke the cardinal rule of not bringing up family. Let's go to this clip.
Basic question. Do you believe homosexuality is a choice?
We're all God's children, Bob, and I think if you were to talk to Dick Cheney's daughter, who is a lesbian, she would tell you that she's being who she was. She's being who she was born as.
Now remember, this is the Sorensen rule. Leave family out of it. Kerry would be asked about this years later in interviews and would defend it, but I think at the time, the voters didn't like it. An Iowa voter later told the New York Times, quote, "I wish he hadn't done that. I don't think he meant anything by it. I just think he could have done without it." And my 5th takeaway from this, which is less a moment, is that, and I have this impression with almost every debate I've watched, in general, by today's standard, Bush was fairly coherent, despite his reputation. Kerry was very substantive as well. These were, like they could have, I remember at the time we always would say, oh man, I wish these were more substantive, but they were by far more substantive and coherent and civilized than what we have today. So those are the key debates I wanted to go through in this sort of television era. And let me just give some wrap-up thoughts and some sort of housekeeping items on structure. If you're keeping track, how many debates do we have, right? This year, we don't even know, as I give this video, how many debates we're going to have. The most debates that we've ever had, not counting the vice presidentials, were 4 in 1960. Kennedy even wanted to add a 5th. The fewest was in 1980 at 1. Obviously, there's some years where we didn't have any at all. There's never been more than 1 vice presidential debate. The length of the debates varies, but largely stays within a certain range. In 1960, the debates were an hour, which is the shortest. There have been more, but generally speaking, they're 90 minutes. The format, the dominant format is the sort of press conference format, which is, the candidates at the lectern with a panel giving questions, usually 2 to 4 reporters, but sometimes there's only one, like Jim Lehrer at times. 1992 brought us the town hall format and the single moderator format. The 2000 election brought us the table debates. Lectern height has been a source of a lot of debate or negotiation. Historically, the taller person has better odds of winning the election generally. This is the halo effect, if you ever want to look that up. But this has prompted some very interesting and hilarious negotiations. One being 1976, when Ford, who's 3.5 inches taller than Carter, Carter's team wanted Carter elevated, and this led to what is called the belt buckle compromise, where Ford's lectern was at his belt buckle, and Carter's intersected 1.5 inches below his buckle points. You might ask yourself, why did the Ford team agree to that? Well, they wanted something else. They wanted to pick the backdrop, which was important to them because Ford's hair was thinning. And so they picked, I don't even remember what color it was, but some color that I guess was more flattering there. Dukakis would go on to negotiate a riser that was 6 inches shorter than Bush's. But Dukakis had to eventually step off the lectern and shake Bush's hand, which by some accounts called attention to Dukakis's height at the very worst moment, which is the last moment of the debates. Lectern design has even been a subject of negotiations. Carter's team during the Carter-Ford debates killed Ford's request for a presidential seal at the lectern. And interestingly enough, Carter's team tried to fight to get a presidential seal 4 years later, unsuccessfully, in the Reagan negotiations. Props and notes are a subject of negotiation. No notes are generally allowed, haven't been for a long time. In 1960, during the West Virginia primary debate, JFK brought a government food surplus package to call attention to malnutrition, but by and large, props have been left out of the debates. 1992, Quayle's team wanted to bring, this is Quayle versus Gore, vice presidential debates. Quayle's team wanted to bring a copy of Gore's book and read passages of it to show how extreme he was allegedly on environmental issues. Gore's team countered that they wanted to bring a potato because Quayle was knocked for not being able to spell potato. You can Google that as an interesting moment when Quayle visited a school. But neither happened. Neither prop was allowed in. In 2004, negotiators added more rules saying, quote, neither candidate may reference or cite any specific individual sitting in a debate audience at any time during debate. They also added that candidates couldn't challenge opponents to have more debates. They couldn't challenge them to take a pledge, and they couldn't directly address each other. Panelist selection has obviously been a big source of contention. I'm not going to really go into that. I mentioned the 84 Leave Women Voters issue there, where they had to go through 80-something reporters before they could get to a slate. There's obviously over the debate over debates. Historian Alan Schroeder has said, quote, it is generally believed that the Kennedy's team won the 1960 negotiation. Republicans and Democrats more or less tied in 1976. Reagan handlers triumphed in 1980 and again in 1984. Bush's team took the 1988 talks, and Clinton's staff prevailed in 92 and 96. Miscalculations by strategists for George W. Bush gave Al Gore an advantage in 2000, but in 2004, Bush negotiators got most of what they wanted in exchange for 3 debates with John Kerry. You'll notice there that a lot of those people had more leverage. The people who, quote-unquote, won the debates had more leverage, but there are certain exceptions, like 92, for example, where Clinton didn't have leverage. Who sponsors and runs the debates has changed over time. 1960 was the networks. The League of Women Voters held prominence in 76, 80, 84. Other organizations like them. Commission on Presidential Debates really took over from 88 forward, but has been in peril lately, which we'll talk about in the next video. We talked about this a little bit, but lectern height, room temperature, lighting set to sign, audience, questioners, cutaways, interruptions, time allocations, topic selection. These are all things that are under contention. Like 2000, there was a fierce debate over lavalier mics, and Karl Rove in 2000 in a postmortem event at Harvard said, quote, if you can't argue over how many debates you're going to have, when you're going to have them, you're left debating important things like how tall the chair is. This is one of the rare moments where the candidates meet face-to-face, sometimes the only moment they meet face-to-face in an entire election. And there are certain debate negotiators who are legendary. James Baker for Reagan and for H.W. is known to have gotten most of what he wanted, but by and large had more leverage. Mickey Kanner was the sort of legendary negotiator for Clinton. My view is this largely has to do with leverage. Most of the people who win the debates have more leverage. the honor of worst negotiators is often said to be the Dole 96 negotiators, who were focused on irrelevant details, and even at one point spent considerable amount of time and capital trying to negotiate a dress code for a live audience. Sidebar on this is I actually have an experience with these. When I worked for Axelrod in 2008, I had certain visibility into debate prep. I would read the debate prep documents and stuff, not because I was counting on to do anything, but because I was managing his email and I got to read all the cool stuff. But one time during the convention in 2008, I was asked to go to a room at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver, which is this ornate hotel in Denver, and I wasn't given any other instructions. And Axe said, just go to that room and you'll get instructions about what to do when you get there. And so I get there and the door flings open, and a guy who I later realized is Bob Bennett, who was the lead negotiator for Democrats over the debates, was in his hotel room. He invited me in, and the room was strewn with paper with black magic marker over all the different pages. And he said, "Oh, you're earlier than I thought." And then he proceeded to, one page at a time, assemble all these pages together. And he said, "Take this to the nearest fax machine you could find," to give you a sense, we're faxing things back then, and fax this over to, and he gave me a name and number. I think it might have been like, somebody in Steve Schmidt or somebody on John McCain's team. Basically, he'd given me the debate memorandum marked up, like basically the contract, to go fax to the Republicans. And so I'm like sweating bullets taking this over to the fax place. And then there was actually a moment where it got caught in the fax machine and I thought it was going to get destroyed. This is the only copy of it, but we eventually got it out there. These debate memorandums, by the way, speaking of, have gotten longer with time. The 1960 equivalent was only a page long. That got to 16 pages in 88, 37 pages in 92. And they've like hovered around 30-something pages throughout most of the aughts, and I have no idea what they are now. Some big takeaways for how to think about these things. Whoever thinks they're winning wants fewer debates, generally speaking. They would also, if you think you're winning, you want debates to be as early as possible so that you can limit the damage from them. The corollary is that the same is true if someone knows they suck at debates. If you think you're not going to be good at debates, you kind of want them to be as early as possible, which may help explain why Biden, despite losing, which in this calculus would make you think he would want to have debates as close as possible to the election, but he scheduled these early in part because I think he and his team probably knew he was going to suck at them. It's generally, debates are generally good for challengers with some exceptions. Carter strategist Pat Caddell said that debates are, quote, the vehicle of the challengers. They're the best device for a challenger to reach and cross the acceptability threshold, with the exception of Dole Clinton 96, where I think the challenger there didn't really benefit from this, and Clinton performed quite well. Fall sports loom large, especially football, so that's a part of the scheduling. Debates also dominate candidate time. Trump may be an exception to this because it seems he might not prepare a ton for these things. But there's what's called the freeze theory by James Baker, where he scheduled a debate with Carter very close to the election. But he says of the debates, he says, quote, they do freeze a campaign, but they also have the ability to move the numbers. So the front runner is always going to be more hesitant to extend the period of time for debates and the number of debates and even the fact of the debates. A Reagan biographer later said, after the debate was agreed to, press coverage and the candidates' speeches became perfunctory, with everyone waiting for the big event. The beneficiary was Reagan. The Carter campaign later admitted after the election that the late debate was a mistake and that they were suckered into it. Amazingly, Reagan turned around and used the opposite approach in 1984. The Washington Post reported that Baker pushed for an earlier debate to avoid quote, undue impact on voters' decision. And this gets back to debate expectations. The lesson here is managing expectations is key. Reagan knew this in 84. He knew that age was going to be a concern. Obviously, he had a great line around that. While others have failed to see themselves properly, Dukakis was too robotic. He really came across that way. Gore was viewed as too arrogant. He came across that way. Bush in 2004 was viewed as stubborn. He came across that way. And so that's really where we are. And I could go on, but this is a lot for a part one. You have now learned probably more than you ever needed to know about debates in the television era. And in the next video, what we're going to go through are the debates in the social media era. So Obama through to modern day. And that's when things get interesting and it becomes about a lot more than what happens on that stage. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, share this with your friends. If you're listening on audio, check out our YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, go and subscribe to the Lost Debate Show wherever you get your podcasts.